Now I'm going to introduce Dr. Johnson. She's very kindly joining us at 6:45 in the morning, her time in England, I think. Dr. Helen Johnson is a principal lecturer in psychology, co-director of the Center for Arts and Wellbeing at the University of Brighton, and principal investigator for the AHRC Everyday Creativity Research Network. But I first came to know Dr. Johnson as a poet. She has over 20 years' experience as a spoken word artist, and her innovative research method, collaborative poetics, combines her experience as a poet, an innovative researcher, and a community activist. Her work focuses on participatory and arts-based research innovations, applications of the arts in enhancing health and well-being, and exploring spoken word communities and practices. But Dr. Johnson's work extends beyond research with active contributions to academic citizenship, community university partnerships, public engagement, and consultancy. Her collaborative poetics method and network offer a transformative approach to underpin this wide-ranging practice, using spoken word and creative writing to enhance individual and community well-being, build critical resilience, and reshape academic research to better serve communities, especially marginalized ones. Her current research projects include enriching understandings and applications of everyday creativity, decolonization in the context of everyday creativity and creative research methods, and community university partnership work exploring collaborative processes and resource development. I am tired just explaining all of the different things you do. It's absolutely amazing. So today, I think we're joined by a lot of people in the field of arts and culture, maybe not as many people from the social sciences. So I think we're going to start off by explaining, Dr. Johnson's going to explain her approach and her research methods and her background. So my first question is, your work is in the field of critical psychology. So how does that differ from mainstream psychology?
Yeah, so critical psychology is, I mean, it kind of does what it says on the tin. It's critical. So it positions itself in opposition to mainstream psychology. And mainstream psychological concepts, theories, and methods. Mainstream psychology is very much about a kind of Western neoliberal idea. It's very much focusing on individuals and individual competition. It very much valorizes the kind of hard science approach with the kind of experimental method, things like neuropsychology. These are the sort of high reputational areas of the field. And this is the sort of mainstream psychology, which is quite possibly what you think of when you think of psychology. Critical psychology positions itself in opposition to that, so it focuses on social change. It positions the researcher back into the research. As critical psychologists, we understand what we do as changing the world and embrace that, and therefore see how our values, our assumptions, our motivations influence the research, and how we can use that, how we can critique that, and how we can use that to seek to change the world for the better. It also challenges the kind of hierarchy of methods, which I know is one of the things that we're going to be talking about, which places the kind of experimental method right at the top of this kind of pyramid, particularly things like double-blind, randomized, controlled trials. So it embraces the role of subjectivity and values in psychology. And part of that is about inclusivity. It aligns very well with things like the decolonization agenda, which has really kind of come to the fore in academia and beyond academia. And really the roots of this come from the idea that psychology is a kind of weird discipline. And I have actually a little infographic that I stole from somewhere, which might be helpful to show you. So I'll see if I can share my screen on it. Here we go. So this isn't mine, I stole it. But it is a nice, useful way of illustrating it. There was a study that was carried out in 2010 by Heinrich et al., where they surveyed the psychological research over this 4-year period. And they came to the conclusion that about 70% of the populations in psychology come from about 12% of the world's population. And even worse than that, about 80% of the research, of this research, was carried out on American and particularly English, Anglo-American psychology undergraduates. So we're taking this really tiny, tiny proportion of the world's population, and then we're saying this is what people are like. And so they coined this acronym of WEIRD. So this is most of the research is being carried out in white, educated, industrialized, rich, developed nations. And even within these kind of weird societies, research has always been, continues to be very restricted in who it researches. This applies to psychology, it applies beyond to the social sciences as well. So, for example, if you take the context of healthcare and medical research, women are often excluded from medical research. Things like the Baltimore Longitudinal Study of Aging, which began in 1958 and claimed to be trying to explore normal human aging, didn't enroll any women at all for the first 20 years that it ran. You also have this kind of really very contested and problematic concept of hard to reach groups, which covers this kind of a widening group of people. You've got ethnic minorities, sexual minorities, people in temporary housing and homeless people, disabled people, older people. You can see like most people are in this category, really. People with low literacy, low computer literacy or access, and so on. So what you get within this then is this assumption that weird, white, straight, cis, middle class, male people are the default. And then this becomes the norm through which everything is compared. And it's a very value-laden concept as well. So you get this idea that with men as default, we're talking about people who are assertive and strong, and then women, in contrast, are submissive and weak. Of course, if you turn that on its head, you could have women as the default, where being cooperative and being gentle is valorized, and then men being seen as kind of domineering and overbearing in comparison. You have this idea that Westerners as extroverted leaders, that's the norm through which we then compare kind of everybody else. And so you get this idea that cooperation and communitarianism are either overlooked or worse, denigrated. And we think in terms of submission. And there's some real classic psychology experiments that look at what they see as being kind of group submission and talk about it in very, very kind of negative, value-laden terms. But you've still got mainstream psychology claiming to be value-free, claiming to be universal. This really, really small group of people within this really small group of people are the norm, and everything else is weird. Whereas, of course, it's quite the opposite. So what you end up with is research that lacks meaning for its subjects. And that lack of meaning and the lack of relevance equates to a lack of impact in communities. You end up with research that isn't really making the difference that it has the potential to make. And this can be a matter of life or death. So again, if you go back to the healthcare context, in England, we have the National Health Service, and we use colour charts as part of something called the APGAR test. And that's used to assess newborns to check for things like jaundice and to see if they're healthy. It's using white skin tones as the healthy norm through which everything else is compared. And that's been shown in quite a recent research to link to higher death rates amongst non-white infants. So you've got this really limited worldview, this really kind of restrictive hierarchy of methods. So it's compounded by this kind of reductionist, simplistic, quantitative understanding of what it means to know that already hugely limited slice of the world. And I would ask really how meaningful a numerical scale is of a complex, multidimensional and transient concept like happiness. We reify these concepts, we treat them as real, and then we think we can measure them with a questionnaire. How many times when you've been completing a survey or a quantitative survey have you wanted to write, it depends? You got a yes or no, a scale of 5, and you want to write, well, you know, it depends. What about contrast? What about contradiction? What about context? Where's the humanity or the emotion in a scattergraph? Where is the researchers drive assumptions and interpretation? Because you have this idea in mainstream psychology that the researcher is objective. They are outside of the research. They're not shaping it in any way, or they shouldn't be. If they are, they're a bad researcher. In critical psychology and the kind of work I do, we're seeking to put the researcher back in the research, to acknowledge our positionality and to use that. There's a really nice quote I wanted to show you about this. I've got it on a slide because it's quite long. And it's, you can catch a shrimp in a certain finely laced fishing net. Try to catch a whale in the same net, and one of two things happens. The net breaks, or the whale is shredded into small bits that lose its whole configuration. If we insist everything must be like a shrimp to fit our net, then the bigger and deeper realities elude us. I don't want to throw away the shrimp with the net, particularly as I'm interested in impactful research and working with communities to do things that will make a difference to them. And numbers can be really rhetorically powerful, and they can really play a role in that. But I do want to understand the beauty, the enormity, and the complexity of the whale. And that's one of the kind of positions that I have within critical psychology and within the work that I'm doing around creative and arts-based methods.
Very nice. We will also hopefully have time for questions afterwards, because a lot of the stuff is rather challenging and cutting edge. So for my next question, you are getting noticed for the work you are doing in the relatively new and expanding field of arts-based research. So Dr. Johnson has been invited back to Cambridge University to talk about her methods at least 8 times at this point. And she's even been invited to speak at the House of Lords. I think she's the only academic I know who's spoken at the House of Lords in England about her research methodology. Can you explain briefly what arts-based research is for the audience members who may not know about it?
Yeah, so I'm a social scientist. I've kind of introduced myself as a psychologist, but I think of myself a bit more kind of broadly, but I'm coming from a social scientific perspective. And so some of what I say it sounds different to different audiences. So it'll be really interesting if we have time for questions to see how people receive this and what it looks like from more of an arts and media perspective. But arts-based research essentially is social scientific research that uses the arts in some way as a form for data collection, data analysis, and or data dissemination. So using it for something like data dissemination, that's the most common form of arts-based research. I might carry out a series of interviews, for example, and then I might either as well as or instead of the kind of standard academic output, I might create a theatre piece, a short film, a poetry show, or a poetry book. I might create collage. I might create a photographic exhibition. Arts for data collection, I might get someone to write a poem and then analyze that poem. Or I might do something like photo elicitation, where I ask people to take photos, and then we get together and we talk about those photos as an illustration and an insight into their lived experience. Where I think it gets most challenging for social scientists anyway, and also most exciting, is when the arts are used for data analysis. So it's not that the arts are simply a thing to mine for data. And it's not that they are the thing where we disseminate the real research. They actually become the research. The poem is the analysis. The film is the analysis. Normally, when I talk to a load of arts people about that, they kind of go, well, yeah, obviously, that's what we do. Obviously, we use the arts as a way to explore and illuminate and communicate lived experiences, social scientific kind of phenomena. When I say it's a social scientist, their heads explode a little bit, because research is for the social scientists, it's not for the artists, and it's us that have that domain and that kind of power. So what I think is really interesting about arts-based research, it has the potential to produce different kinds of knowledge which is embodied, which is emotive, where that researcher positionality is very much in there. It embraces things that almost probably every other social scientific research method struggles with: multiplicity, contradiction, non-linearity, non-verbal text, visual text, liminality, the bits and the edges, the unspoken, the silent, and so on. So it's really, I think, really, really exciting. Some people see arts-based research as falling under qualitative research. So you have qualitative research, and then arts-based research comes under that. Other people have suggested it's a third paradigm, a whole new paradigm, and there's a whole debate around that. But I think just the very notion that we have a new paradigm of research with this is really interesting and exciting, and not something that happens every day. So with arts-based research, you have the potential to engage wider and broader audiences than are typically reached with your standard academic output. But you also have the possibility for something really kind of exciting and rebellious. And you have the possibility to carry out research which is relevant, which is impactful, and which leads to social change. And that ties in really well with some of those premises and principles of critical psychology. There's another quote that I wanted to share with you on this. And this comes from one of my kind of favorite all-time texts around creative research methods. There's a fantastic book called The Authentic Dissertation, which I would strongly recommend looking up if you want to find more about writing differently and researching differently. So this is Tom Peron, who says, of course, there are times when a degree of equilibrium and stability in our lives is welcomed, and traditional forms of research may sometimes be useful for supplying it. Still, a wide array of tacit underlying social and cultural conditions in which such research is conducted and within which its findings are intended to be applied may be avoided, neglected, and ignored in the process. The enormous power of arts-based inquiry rests in its unique capacity for doing what other forms of research cannot, inviting and enabling members of an audience to vicariously re-experience facets of the empirical world. Good arts-based research does not merely aim to bring them closer towards a singular version of the truth of that world, but enables them to see facets of it in a different light, and even to envisage how it might indeed be made otherwise. And that's one of the real powers, I think, of the arts and of arts-based research, around imagining alternative possible futures and helping to lead the way to those. So arts-based research is emotive, it's engaging, it's accessible, it's interdisciplinary. It has the potential for radical transdisciplinarity through embodiment, fluidity, liminality, subjectivity, and multilinear and nonverbal texts.
Very good. So my next question, I think, addresses kind of the key to what unlocks a lot of what you're talking about in your research. And that is, your work also incorporates elements of participatory research. How do you combine that with your arts-based research?
Yeah, so I'll start off by telling you a bit about what we mean by participatory research. Arts-based research is really exciting. It has all this great potential, but it's also most often top-down. So it's the researcher is shaping it, the researcher's leading it, the researcher's telling you how it is. So I might, for example, get my participants to write some poems, and then I'm analysing those for the data, and it's my analysis and it's my research. Or I might interview people and then create what we might call a data poem from those interview transcripts, but I'm making that poem. So it's typically very kind of standard research model in that sense. Participatory research kind of turns that on its head. So instead of seeing our participants as subjects to be mined for data, they become co-researchers. They become active participants in the research process. They help us to design the research, to carry out the research, and they own the research. And this fits again very well with the principles of critical psychology. It means that the research can be meaningful, it can be relevant. It's kind of quite hard for it not to be meaningful and relevant if you're doing it properly. So participatory research is interdisciplinary, it's multi-method, and it's messy. And relationships are really key to it. So the relationships that we have with our co-researchers or between co-researchers is underpinned by shared values and by a shared desire for change. Like arts-based research, there's a focus on process rather than just product, because through doing the research, we are sharing skills, we're sharing knowledge, we're gaining a sense of ownership and empowerment and so on. And that can be as important as what you produce at the end of it. And like arts-based research and also critical psychology, it raises questions around things like what counts as knowledge, who gets to decide, how does research funding get distributed, who should be holding the purse strings, which issues, which groups of people should it be about, who is research for? So participatory research aims to be democratic, community-focused, relevant, impactful, and meaningful. And as I said, to value that process alongside the product in a way that mirrors arts practice. So then kind of coming back to the other part of your question about how do these all come together? Like I said, most arts-based research doesn't tend to be participatory. It's still very top-down. And so I think it, therefore, doesn't realize its full potential. A few years ago, I designed a method called collaborative poetics, which you'll find if you Google it. And collaborative poetics is a participatory arts-based research method. So we work in groups of in research collectives with artists, with academics, with poets, participants and other co-researchers who are all seen as kind of equal in terms of power, knowledge and skills, and all bring things into that relationship. We design and carry out the research as a group, and we own that research. It has poetry, creative writing, and also spoken word at the heart of it, but it's also quite magpie-like in that it will use, whatever methods kind of do the job, because it's interested in making a change. So it's about exploring and communicating people's lived experiences through participatory arts-based research, and then seeking to use those as a pathway through to social change. And it works with a concept called critical resilience in order to do that. And critical resilience, again, is an oppositional concept. So it sets itself against the kind of mainstream model of resilience, which risks individualizing social problems. So, if we know that, say, children in poverty tend to do less well in school, the mainstream model of resilience might focus on building up the resilience so that children in poverty can do better in school. It doesn't solve the problem, right? The problem isn't the children, the problem is the poverty. So it risks kind of reinforcing those problems. Critical resilience it builds on things like Freire's concept of conscientization, and this idea of kind of building our knowledge and our power, and building our individual and community resilience, but not instead of social change, but as a pathway through to social change. So again, it really aligns strongly with critical psychology, which is where we started off.
That is the aspect of your research that really caught my eye, that I'm really excited about. But that's not all you're doing. Recently, you have begun incorporating the idea of everyday creativity into your work. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, so that one of the things that I'm doing currently at the moment is I have some Arts and Humanities Research Council money to develop an international network on everyday creativity. So there's an everyday creativity research network. And again, if you Google it, you'll find it. We have various strands within it, and one of those is on creative research methods. So I'm the principal investigator, but I also run the creative research methods strand. So there's a kind of clear tie-in to what we've been talking about. And it's also a good time for a plug in that we have, amongst other things, we have a discussion board, an online discussion board. So it's not a mailing list, but it's a board that anyone can post onto. It's a JISC discussion board, JISC. And anyone can join it, and it would be wonderful if some of the people listening here today join it, and we can help to grow our network. It's a site for discussion, and so we have, if you're interested in everyday creativity, you can post up there, you can contribute to discussions, and there's some really exciting conversations happening on there. But I ought to tell you a bit more about what everyday creativity actually is. So again, it's an oppositional concept. It is positioning itself really in response to the kind of big C, elite or genius kind of model of creativity, where historically a lot of the research has lain in creativity. So that's your Leonardo da Vinci's and your Mozarts, who are creating these kind of exceptional genius levels of artworks, and not just artworks, but a lot of the work in this area focuses on the arts. Everyday creativity instead is about everyday people in everyday contexts. So in communities, in families, in the home, doing things like community choirs, rock painting, knitting, baking, gardening, comic drawing, these everyday pursuits that many of us engage in. Again, it goes beyond the arts. But a lot of the work I'm interested in kind of sits within the arts. But you might include things like, say, citizen science in there as well. But everyday creativity stresses cultural democracy. So a bit like I was saying with participatory research, it refocuses and it critiques the idea of who art should be for, who creativity should be for, who gets to say that something is creative, who gets to say that it's valuable, who gets to own it. So it raises questions again around who our practice is for, who, if anyone, should rate its quality, what we do and should value. Again, it focuses on process over product, because very much it's very often about the act of knitting, of painting a rock, of making a collage, of singing in a choir, rather than necessarily, creating the next Mona Lisa. It also is very much about, as with participatory research, about relationality. Very often, not always, it can be an individual alone in a room, but very often it's about that community and those relationships as well. And this is all hugely relevant to a critical psychology paradigm, to participatory research, and to ways of researching rebelliously. So it speaks to issues around inclusivity, coloniality, power, and impact in psychological and social science research that have been kind of threads throughout what we've been talking about. And arts-based research and participatory research, particularly when taken together, I think goes some way towards addressing these issues, but they don't resolve them. So researchers in these fields still typically or very often fall into this trap of retaining their privilege, our privilege, through elitist academic and artistic frameworks and hierarchies. It's very difficult to see and to question our own assumptions. I'll give you an example. I've been carrying out some research at the moment, working with a community partner, so not an academic, member of a community organization, putting together materials to enable community organizations to do evaluations and scoping activities and other bits of research. And so we've been having long conversations, and we've been talking and designing materials, and then my colleague has been going off and piloting them and bringing them back. In the process of doing this, we realized that we had completely different ideas about what research was. We were talking about completely different things. We had some really different ideas about what the process was, what it meant to do research. We were using language very differently. And yet this wasn't the first time that we had partnered together. We'd already carried out successful participatory research previously, and we thought we were talking about the same thing. It was only when we really sat down and spoke to each other at length and collaborated very closely in a very horizontal kind of power hierarchy that we realized how far apart we were. So how can you know about the limitations of a world within which you're created? It's only when you start really collaborating with other people and including them that you can begin to address this. And a lot of, even participatory research can be quite tokenistic. You can have things that look more like what we call, and even the word kind of tells you a little bit about the problems, participant validation, where you carry out the research and then you go to the participants at the end and expect them to kind of say, yeah, that's great. So it can be quite tokenistic. As I said, the arts-based research can be quite top-down. So I think when we start to question our concepts, our methods, and really start to kind of collaborate, we can really start to get somewhere. And prior to that starts with the recognition that you're not already doing it. It's that kind of old cliche of to solve a problem, you have to admit you have a problem in the first place. And a lot of the time in participatory research and arts-based research, people don't admit they have a problem. They don't see they have the problem. So I think everyday creativity can help us to do some kind of bridge building here. Everyday creativity in the context of participatory arts-based research can help us to prioritize intrinsic value, community-based action, grassroots leadership, culturally rooted practice, and to reassess our practices, our values, to consider who they include, who they exclude, and where the power is. And I've tried to kind of illustrate that in a little diagram, because there's lots of different parts, lots of different concepts and ideas that I just kind of rattled off. So arts-based research is emotive, it's engaging, it's accessible, it's interdisciplinary, it has radical transdisciplinary potential through embodiment, fluidity, liminality, subjectivity, multilinear, non-verbal texts. Participatory research is interdisciplinary, it's multi-method, it's underpinned by shared values and desire for change. It values process alongside product, and it aims to be democratic, community-focused, relevant, and impactful. And on the third part of the triangle, everyday creativity is about everyday people, everyday practice, intrinsic value, community, relationality. It values process alongside product, and it prioritizes and centers cultural democracy. And my work on collaborative poetics fits on this kind of left-hand side. It's around arts-based participatory research. The Everyday Creativity Research Network brings together arts-based research and everyday creativity. And in the middle of all these, I think you have something that has the potential to look like truly democratic research practice. I don't think everyday creativity is a panacea. I don't think it's the only way of doing it, but I think it's a useful concept which can help to orient us towards ways of doing things differently. And that, I think, is really interesting.